has served as joint editor of the RSS journal Applied Statistics. Many papers, many fields. He also wrote a book. I know the book very well. When I was some years ago a PhD student, my advisor told me, I have a friend just published the book on smoothing. So that's how I came to know Adrian many years ago, some years ago. Apart from smoothing, Adrian Bowman has worked on flexible regression methods, spatio-temporal data analysis, data visualization, with many applications in a variety of fields, especially in environmetrics. Today, Professor Bowman will introduce many of us to the analysis of human face images. To me, it's a new argument, so I don't know so much, but since the story starts with 3D surface image analysis and has applications in facial animation, biology, and anatomy. What I would like to stress is that Adrian has the attitude to work with applications and real data, and I like this really a lot. If you go through his publication list, you will immediately see how his research combines new statistical methods with real data challenges. In my opinion, this is what we really call data analysis. So, this is a very short presentation, and I just want to thank, because I'm really thankful for you coming here, a long trip, and I'm just glad for that. So I wish and I ask you to come to the desk, and the floor now is yours.
So, buongiorno, mille grazie. That exhausts my knowledge of Italian, I'm sorry, but I do want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. And I would like to talk about faces for the next little while. So let me show you some. These are some of the people I've had the pleasure of working with for the past few years. And I've tried to follow that good career advice that you should always try to work with people who are cleverer than you are. So that's been my aim, and I've largely achieved it. But in introducing my collaborators, of course, I show their faces. I don't show their hands, their feet, or any other part of their anatomy. I show their faces, because the face is the way in which we present ourselves to the world. We spend a large part of our daily lives looking at other people's faces, and we're very good at interpreting what we see. So I'd like to talk about one or two applications which are based on modeling and analyzing facial data. It is interdisciplinary work, and we had the benefit of some funding from a body called the Wellcome Trust a few years back, which enabled us to bring together a team of people from different sorts of areas who were involved in this. But let me begin by showing you an example of the data. Now, of course, there is a huge amount of work on modeling faces. And things like deep learning and so on have been particularly successful at identifying faces in images, and Google and Facebook use that kind of stuff to very impressive effect. Not talking about any of that. We know who everybody is, we know what we're doing, it's laboratory conditions. And the other thing that's different about the data that we're dealing with is it's not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. It's always a little bit disconcerting when you see nothing inside the head. But remember, this is just a system which looks at an object and recovers an image of the surface. It's an image which has perhaps 100,000 points, each with an XYZ 3D coordinate and a color attached. So that's one observation. And the question is, what do we do with it, especially when we have many of those observations in any particular context? Here's an example of the camera. We have a camera like this in our own department, and it consists of multiple cameras, which you can see perhaps on the left and the right there. If you look at me with your left eye and you look at me with your right eye, the images are slightly different, and your brain is fantastically clever at working out how far away things are by the mismatch in those images. The camera system does something similar, stereophotogrammetry, to recover the third dimension from multiple 2D images. That's a very accurate and very well-developed system, but it's quite expensive. And so we're working with a company in Scotland who are developing a sensor which just slips on top of a tablet and aims to do the same thing with a quick scan of a face, much cheaper, but under development. And of course, phones potentially have the capability of doing this, but at the moment, getting access to the data that is available is more problematic. So clearly, this is a means of taking images which has the ability to help with a number of different types of study. And here's some other examples. Very simple example of a mussel shell, which is just about the simplest shape you could imagine. And the one on the right is a fish jaw, very small object, but imaged with, I think it's micro CT, which gives a very great deal of detail. And again, the interest is in comparing groups of these shapes, modeling it over time with covariates and so on. So how on earth do we do that? Well, I'm going to stick with faces, which in some ways are quite simple objects because we know what a face looks like. It has certain features we would expect to see. And I should say from the outset that what this is crying out for is a suitable Bayesian model, which will take advantage of the fact that if I tell you where the eyes and the mouth are, you know where the nose is likely to be. We're working on that. I will refer to it occasionally as we go, but it's not sufficiently mature yet, really, to talk about in detail. So if you like, what I'll talk about is more the likelihood end of things, but I will mention the prior as we go. Now, I have the benefit of a little bit more time than most other speakers at the conference. Thank you for that. So what I'd like to do is cover quite a lot of ground, if I can. And the way I'd like to do that is not to stress the technical detail. Personally, I find that listening to talks, if I get the concept, I'm doing quite well. The technical detail is probably something that's best studied later. So I can refer people to papers or answer questions along those lines. There will be some technical detail, but not much. And I'd like to concentrate on the concept and allow that to discuss one or two different applications. So we'll look at how we might build a model for a single face, how we then look at multiple faces and think about the variability that's present in an object like that, and then look at some specific applications. So here's a face. The traditional way of approaching this is through anatomical landmarks. That goes back a couple of 100 years, and of course it was all one could do when measurement was not, and data was not so easily available as it is now. And so there is a very well-developed system of identifying the tip of the nose, the corners of the mouth, and so on, which then become the basis of analysis. And in this general area of statistical shape analysis, if you want to know more, read the book by Dryden and Mardy, Ian Dryden, Canty Mardy. A very, very good description, very authoritative account of all of that and more. So, however, that's rather a simple summary of this 100,000 points which are sitting on the surface. We must be able to do better than that. Of course we can. And then most people would jump immediately to some kind of model for the entire surface, some function or some description which would cover the whole surface. The particular line that we have taken and are continually trying to advocate is where does the information lie? And there is some evidence that the information principally lies in curves of valleys and ridges. If you draw the ridges and valleys in the face, you've more or less got the key information. By definition, because the ridges and valleys are where things bend most, by definition, the intervening patches are much less curved, are now simpler. So that's the view I'm going to take. It gives us a description which is intrinsically one-dimensional. It's in 3D space, but it's a one-dimensional curve, and or a set of them, rather. And if we want to go to a full surface description, we can fill in the gaps fairly easily. So that's the particular perspective I'd like to take, and that's what I mean by a model. It's not a model for a big data set. It's a model for an individual face. It's an estimation process for a single object where we estimate those particular features. So how do we do it? Well, geometry is going to matter here. Differential geometry is going to be key. And I can write what I know about differential geometry on one slide, which is that at any particular location on a differentiable manifold, there is this very helpful result which says it looks like a quadratic. It's a bit like Taylor's theorem, which in statistics gets us out of trouble so often. It's an incredibly useful theorem. And this is its equivalent in differential geometry, which says at any point on the surface, you will find, shrink down to a small enough neighborhood, you will find a direction of maximum curvature, and orthogonal to that, a direction of minimum curvature, and those two describe what's going on. So if we run through all the different quadratic shapes, then that captures the types of surface that we're going to encounter at small scale. And although these are very, very old results, of course, only relatively recently there have been some helpful suggestions made about how to package the information on the direction and size of curvature in these two orthogonal directions into other ways of expressing the information. And one of them is this thing called shape index. And what it does is, oh, I'm sorry, I moved too fast there. But what it does is look at the type of surface that we have. I just need to be patient, it will come. Which is on a scale of -1 to 1. -1 is a cup, and it goes through to a ridge and a saddle point, to a valley, to a ridge and a cap, rather. And that gives a very useful description of the different kinds of surfaces that we might see. Okay, so we have a face which is discrete but very high dimensional. We have a means of characterizing the surface shape at any point. So what we could do is just go around the face and at any position, take a little neighborhood, calculate a quadratic surface from the normal, and what that allows us to do is paint the surface with an indication of the kind of surface that's present at each location. So red is a cap, like the nose tip. Green is a cup or a bowl, like the pits of the eyes, and so on. And so already we can see that that information gives us very good steer on where the key features of the face might be, and the yellows are the ridges, and the blues are the valleys. And if we line up the traditional landmarks, which have historical definitions often, and are based on very careful orientation of the head and the points that you see, they match up in natural ways with the differential geometry information. So we've actually, in this interdisciplinary setting, tried to advocate that the definitions of landmarks should be based on the geometry of the surface, not on any other careful orientations. Okay, so how do we find these things? How do we find these curves? And this is where I say, we need Bayesian model. We will get there eventually, but I'm going to just sketch for you the likelihood bit of this, and I'm going to do it in the context of starting with the landmarks. Clearly, we want to do away with having to identify those manually as well, and there's a good prospect of doing that. But let me just indicate how this might work by taking some landmarks and saying, where's the curve in between them, and using the mouth, the valley of closed lips in a mouth, as a means of illustrating that. So we can paint the surface to indicate what kind of surface we've got. We're after the blue of the valley, and so we can ignore points which don't have that signal. We then say, well, where is the valley? What's the definition of a valley? And that's actually a little trickier than you might imagine. We're used to thinking of functions where we have x, y covariate, and z is a response, and so we have one-to-one kind of situation, and we can think about definitions along those lines. But that's not what we have here. We just have a surface sitting in space. The orientation is arbitrary. It doesn't matter. Shape, from one perspective, is what's left over once you take away location. Doesn't matter. Orientation, which doesn't matter. And possibly even scale, which in some sense doesn't change the intrinsic shape. So here is some helpful guidance from the literature. John Kent and others have papers on this. And if we think of a particular point and look at its curvatures again, then one definition of a valley curve is that if we look across the valley, if you like, then at any point, the valley curve, the path at the bottom, is where that curvature is maximized along the direction of principal curvature of the point we start at. It's kind of, you need a moment or two to get your head around that, but it's quite a good way of defining where the valley is. And that has encouraged people to think about point-based definitions and point-based constructions of where the valley curve might lie. But I think there's a lot of advantage, because we expect these curves to be smooth, to think in terms of smooth functions for curves right from the beginning. Functional data analysis kind of thinking. So if we're after a curve, we might parameterize it, a path P, parameterize it in the usual functional data analysis way, through some path length or arc length parameter S. And then we have three functions. Where does X go as a function of X, S? Where does Y go as a function of S? Where does Z go as a function of S? And the thing that's going to guide us is not only the type of surface, we know we're looking for a valley, but also the strength of the curvature. At the valley path, it should be maximized. So rather than think of point-based definitions, at the bottom of the slide there's a proposal of a curve-based definition. And because each point is locally optimal, we could say that the integral along the curve, the integral of the curvature along the curve, should also be optimal. If each point is, then the integral will be too. There's a standardization going on here, because one way in which we could mop up as much curvature as possible is to shoot about all over the place and try and pick up everything we find. And that's not what we want to do. So we'll standardize it by length, or later standardize by smoothness, to ensure that we constrain to appropriate types of curve. So that's the criterion, if you like, that we can work with. And we have in the data, although it looks like a continuous surface, we observe the data in discretized form, although at a very high resolution. So there's a discrete version of the integral to work with. Okay, so we've got this surface. We've got the idea we want to mop up the curvature of the right type. How do we do that? Well, the trouble is we have no natural coordinate system. We have to construct one to help us. And so if we use the landmarks, which here are going to mark the ends of the curves, one starting point would be to think of some kind of linear approximation. What do we mean by that? Well, if you take a plane which contains the two landmark endpoints, you still have the freedom of movement of the angle of that plane. So we could simply search through the angles, as these plots indicate, until we find the one where the cut, the intersection of the plane with the path, is described, with the surface, which describes the path along the surface. When we integrate that, we get as much curvature as we possibly can. And so the one in the middle does that quite effectively. There it is from a different perspective, and I think you can just see the black line, perhaps not very clearly, which is the linear cut, if you like, which gets us roughly in the right place. But we know it's not going to be a particularly good description of the details of that curve. So how do we improve? Well, one definition of a manifold, perhaps the definition of a manifold, which is really what we've got, is that it's something which behaves locally like 2 dimensions, although it's actually embedded in 3 dimensions. So we really need a way of working in 2 dimensions, which is going to enable us to track across the manifold. But the trouble is, we start off in 3. So now that we've got this reference point, the black line is our first approximation at this, that gives us an axis of a sort. The distance along that line will give us one of the coordinates. And if we think of some point on the manifold, like one of those red points, we can just project it down onto that reference curve, and then we have 2 axes. One, the distance along to the projection point, the other, the distance up or down to the point of interest on the manifold. So that enables us to go into 2 dimensions now. It's a non-linear transformation, but because it's a manifold and has the property that locally it's 2-dimensional, that should be a good approximation. And we can then employ whatever methods are appropriate to try to estimate a curve, of which there are, of course, very many. Some of them have already appeared, of course, in talks at the conference earlier. So what I'm going to do is simply use the curvature that remains at each point. So this is a 2-dimensional system, coordinate system, but the color indicates the strength of the curvature at each location. And we're going to try to come up with a curve which will capture more of the curvature than we currently have. Now, we want to work in a continuous framework, not a discrete one. So the quick summary here is that we're going to represent this surface not through its discrete points, but through a P-spline surface with 12 degrees of freedom, which will capture as much of the variation as we need. And then the question is, where is the ridge in this surface which describes the curvature? And one way of approaching that, well, there are many ways of approaching that, but one way is simply to discretize along the reference curve and allow those points to move to maximize the integral of the curvature, but to constrain them to move in a smooth manner. So P-spline-like thinking is expressed in the equations on the slide. I'm not going to dwell on the detail of that. Newton's method, because this is a non-linear problem, Newton's method is an obvious solution to finding route to finding a solution, and actually that converges very quickly. I give you those equations just to show you the detail exists, rather than encourage you to look at them. We can discuss those later if you wish. So actually, that red line is the end result of applying that criteria of where is the maximum curvature, and it does visually capture where the ridge is quite satisfactorily. Now, we're not done yet, because we've now solved the problem in a two-dimensional location, and we started originally in a three-dimensional location. So we have to backtrack to our original space. And if you are familiar with barycentric interpolation, this helps us hugely, because in three-dimensional space we have the points, but we can also construct a triangulation, sort of Delaunay-like triangle, or Voronoi tessellation sort of thing, where you can have lines and edges joining adjacent points. Now, that tessellation still applies in the two-dimensional setting, and so if we have a solution which tells us point in this 2D space, there's the triangle which contains it, we use the vertices of the triangles, a weighted average of those to describe where the point is. We use the same weighted average back in 3D space, and that fixes the problem. So apologies to those of you who really like to study the technical detail in this. I did warn you, we're going to try and look at the conceptual view of it. I hope I've given you enough of that to have some idea of what's going on. But the end result is that on this surface, we can track the valleys and estimate the valley and the ridges curves. And here is one example with the original texture on the top, and then reminding you that we've used the signal of what kind of surface it is on the bottom right, and the signal of the curvature, which is perhaps less clear to see from the slide, which then is the thing that we maximize to track the path. Now, I've shown you one example. I've done a simulation study looking at the effectiveness of this, and I want to link it to the question raised earlier about where is the information in a shape. The shape has 100,000 points. If I take one of those 100,000 points. If I take one of those points out, you could tell me where to put it back in, because the surface is so well defined, you don't need 100,000 points to describe it clearly. But where is the information? Well, I'd like to draw the contrast again between going for the ridges and valleys and then going, as opposed to going for some much broader description of the surface and seeing where the ridges and valleys end up. And this was a little experiment where we created artificially valleys, added some spatially correlated noise, and did a comparison of taking a surface view and taking a curve, ridge and valley view, in estimating the curves. And of course, it's perhaps no surprise that we do slightly better in estimating the curves if you target them than tackling the problem of describing the whole surface and then saying, well, where are the curves within that? And there is some evidence in some of the data analysis we've done that actually looking at the curves is a more efficient thing to do. It gives more insight because it's a more compact description of where the information is than the whole surface. Okay, so we can roll that idea out across the face, reminding you that traditional starting point is points, landmarks, still widely used, that the end result might be a model which gives a surface for the whole, a description of the whole surface, but I'm trying to argue the case that the key point in that is finding the ridges and the valleys, which is where the action is in terms of curvature. And that's then the possibility, gives the possibility of fitting a model which is consistent from subject to subject, same number of points, or the same, it really is a functional description, but often we're going to express it in a discrete form with points which describe the curves and all the rest of it. Okay, that was a whistle-stop tour of estimation. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about variability, which of course is the key thing that we often bring to any problem, is our understanding of variability, and then look at some very specific applications. Now, there are some other details we have to contend with here, because there is this issue of registration. If I take your photograph and your photograph, there's nothing which forces those two pictures to be in the same coordinate system. And that's a problem that occurs right across shape analysis. We have to register things together, and Procrustes analysis or Procrustes registration is a good solution. If you have points, let me give you, and it's really just least squares, saying move this so that the location, the orientation, and if necessary the scale, ensure that this set of points matches that set of points point by point as much as possible. So here is a set of landmarks from several faces, and they're just a cloud of points. If we apply Procrustes registration and match them up, then we can see a much more structure of what's going on, and we see the variability in the points of the eyes, the tips of the nose, and so on, which actually isn't all that great. Faces have a very high degree of similarity to one another. And if we just look at the mean of those individual clusters, then that gives us a mean shape, and so on. Now, there's a huge amount of technical and theory detail around that, but that is the flavor of what Procrustes registration is trying to do. And linked back to an earlier comment that what we need is a Bayesian model here, here's the prior. If people have gone to the effort of marking up faces in this level of detail, and we're able to show the variability here, that's a prior information on where things are on the face. And so that's hugely useful in building bigger models. Right, here is then a mean. So we've got lots of faces. We've taken hundreds of faces, just control information. Let's look at women. We'll come back to sexual dimorphism, differences between men and women in shape in a moment. Here is a set of data on women that we've constructed models and aligned them all and all the rest of it. So I could show you that representation, but what I'm going to do is show you a more detailed face just for visualization purposes. So we can take a face, which has its own model, and for any model output or model that we wish to discuss, we can warp or map that face on so you see a little bit more human detail of what the face is rather than the slightly more discrete model form. Okay, so what have we got? We've got hundreds of faces. Each of those faces is a model which might be represented with 1,000 dimensions even after reduction to this description. So we have a huge multivariate data issue. And of course, principal components is a natural way of beginning to think about, let's reduce the dimensionality in ways that still capture the variation, and that's widely used. How do we apply principal components here? Well, if you think of a single face, we have a representation which might have 500 points. If we take 500 x's, 500 y's, and 500 z's of those points, there's a vector of 1,500 which describes that shape, and so we can apply any multivariate methods we like in principle to that, knowing that the results of what we get can also be unpacked back into a 3D shape. That's the broad summary of where we go. So, principal components. Here is a description on the left from the bottom to top of the scores, and that you see the variation increasingly or decreasingly explained up the components. And on the right is what those components represent, the eigenvectors, the movement through principal component space is re-expressed as a shape change. And I think it's quite effective. I'll show you different ways of doing this, but I think it's quite effective just to plot these two surfaces over one another. RGL in R is a wonderful device for this sort of data. If you haven't come across it for 3D data, it's just, I was going to say the bee's knees. That's a very English expression which you may not understand, but it's just perfect for this. So the first component in the top left of those four figures is a lengthening or a widening. These are kind of large-scale effect. There are more subtle changes with the prominence of the center as opposed to the periphery, and so on. And so we can sit and look at those and interpret them. You can also animate. So here is the first component, again, showing it as a movement in the broad width and height. The second one in more about the interior and the exterior. And the third one is about the prominence of the nose and the chin and the way that the angle changes there. You get a bit seasick after looking at these for a while, so I will move on. So principal components, very standard method. One of the kind of sub-themes I'd like to keep mentioning is this idea of not looking at just at individual components, but looking at subspaces of this principal component. And one approach to that is to say, well, if we stop at the first 10 components, it's still a 10-dimensional space, we have a description of what normal control, whatever that means, facial shape might look like. And so one device is simply to track through that space, randomly choose points in it, and then just track from one point to another. An idea from the 1980s called the Grand Tour, if anybody remembers that, for multivariate data. And that just generates faces. I'm using the model here rather than the template on top. That generates faces which correspond to nobody in the data set, but give us some idea of what facial shape might look like. And I'm going to return, that's just a visual device at the moment, but I'd like to return to that later on when we get to one of the applications. Yes, I was forced to participate in this too. So here is my face now superimposed on the model. It's quite interesting that the texture, in terms of recognition, and I'm not talking about recognition, but in terms of recognition, you see me, no matter what the underlying face is, at least I see me, maybe you don't see me. So there's something about the visual, what goes on inside our heads about recognition of facial shape and shape of any kind, which is an additional dimension to the quantitative description that we might seek to make. Okay, just moving forward in small steps here. What about sexual dimorphism? By which I mean, now sexual identity, of course, is a much more complex thing. So I'm talking about the presence of two X's or an X and a Y chromosome and how that affects itself physiologically in facial shape. What makes men different from women? Now, you may think that's a stupid question, because a lot of the time we can so easily, we think, recognize whether we have a male or a female shape. But actually, if you remove the cues of hairstyle, maybe skin condition or makeup or whatever, clothing certainly, then here's a face, and I invite you to ask yourself, is that male or female? It's female. Did you get it right? So actually, the intrinsic shape, removing all the other cues, is not so different. And that's, of course, of interest biologically in lots of settings, sexual dimorphism in various species. So what we could do here, as a first step, we've got means. Remember I talked before about this Procrustes registration, and once you've got that, you just take the average of the points, and that gives you approximately a mean. So here is a mean male face, which is the pink, just to reverse the usual stereotype. So the male face is pink, and the female face is green, means, and they're just superimposed on top of one another. Now, come on, we're doing statistics here, and we haven't done any statistics yet. We're just estimated things, and a mean is not where we're going to stop. So how do we know what the, how do we do the inference on this? That, by the way, is just putting on the detail for visualization purposes of a more detailed facial shape. Well, we've got the components. And a standard thing to do would be to just go down the components and do a t-test on whether males and females are different from each. We need to be a little bit careful about that because, of course, the components are derived from a process which has already got a criteria to maximize variance. That's got nothing to do with the group structure, usually, the way it's implemented. You can do it with the group structure. Leave that discussion aside for the moment. And going to conferences is a very helpful thing because you meet people who know so much more than you do. And at the previous conference I was at, a very helpful conversation with a gentleman who was able to point to the technical detail on why doing t-tests on scores from principal components does not necessarily produce the reference distribution you think it does, not necessarily a t-distribution. So the route out there is to do a permutation test. Even that you have to be slightly careful about what you're interpreting, but a permutation test will give you the evidence. And so if we do a global test, something like the Hertelling's t-squared essentially, that's overwhelmingly saying there's evidence of a difference in males and females. If we look at individual components repeatedly, we will get further evidence about whether that component is different from males and females. But of course, that component was constructed in a way that's got nothing to do with males and females. So here's where the subspaces come in again. I think a good way to think about this is, for the benefits of illustration, here's principal component 3, 4, and 5. Sorry, 3, 4, 5, and 7, I beg your pardon, each of which shows some evidence of differences in males and females. But I think the better way to do it is to combine those into a single representation which simultaneously moves through the space defined by all 4 of those components and gives us a full description of how the shape changes between male and female. And it reproduces pretty much the sort of shape change we saw in the mean, but it's backed up now by some proper analysis to defend what's going on. As a slight aside, did you know, and I didn't till recently, that you can decompose principal components into affine and non-affine components? And basically, it's doing a kind of regression, so we take the mean and we allow the mean to be linearly transformed to match as closely as possible each individual shape. And that transformation is not a rigid transformation. You're scaling different directions by different amounts. That's the affine bit. And the fitted values give you the affine, and the residuals, which of course sit in an orthogonal space, give you the non-affine. So that's quite useful on some occasions. Here's another quick example. What's the difference between Chinese faces and British faces? It's usually very easy to spot whether someone is ethnically British or ethnically Chinese. What is it about faces which, can you express what the difference is? Well, a model helps us to home in on that. And here is the end result of comparing 2 groups of faces. The pink is the British, and the green is the Chinese. So Chinese have a broader, flatter face compared to the more sharp British features, which stand out in the middle here. And since this is a workshop on classification, I couldn't resist putting in at least one classification example. So actually, if you take the first principal component of this, you will classify British and Chinese people completely correctly, because it's such a strong signal. You might ask, well, is this just a simple global movement, a global stretching that somehow or other, if you apply that affine transformation, you would capture all of the essential shape? So we can split the component into its affine and its non-affine components, and if you do the analysis on those, you can easily see that you do need both. It's kind of obvious when you go back and look at the original picture that the movement of the brow here is not consistent with the movement of the lower face. So if necessary, that can be an additional tool in the tool bag. Right, what I'd like to do is to skate through some applications which build on this idea of constructing a model for a face and then looking at some simple tools for analyzing them. And the first one is rather a weird one. When I was first told this by my collaborator, who is a neuroscientist, I found it very astonishing. But there is a group of cells in utero, as the fetus develops in the womb, there's a single group of cells which later differentiates into the face and the brain. You can see that might be true just because of the spatial proximity of those two things, but it means that if something happens during development, then it may express itself in both the face and the brain. And so that means that there is potentially some information in facial shape about the brain. Now that immediately puts us into uncomfortable territory, for 100 years ago people were diagnosing criminals by saying what the shape of their cranium was and all that nonsense. But this is a well-defined biological process, which of course you can see must be true, because I have a friend who has Down's syndrome, and people with Down's syndrome, is that understood in Italian, that term? Yes. Have a characteristic facial shape which is usually quite strong. And that's because those two things go together. And there are other syndromes which have similar kinds of exhibit similar features. This was a study, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and the jury is out. People debate at length whether these kind of conditions have neurodevelopmental origin or whether they have an environmental later in life origin. And in schizophrenia, there is some evidence about brain shape, which suggests that that may be different, which strengthens the neurodevelopment side of things. And this was a study which was looking at schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in Ireland. And the numbers are small because the data are difficult to get, of course. And it's never going to be definitive, but it's because of that. But it's an opportunity to look for signals in facial shape linked to the different patient groups that are represented here. I'm just going to cut to the chase because we're getting towards the end, I know. And using a model for individual faces, we're looking at principal components as a key method, but actually we're going to look in the non-affine space because we don't really expect this to be a big global change. It's going to be, if it's there, it's going to be something more subtle. So I think it's legitimate to say, let's look at the non-affine space. And if you do that, then this shape change, which if you look closely, you may be able to see, which is the prominence of the oral and to some extent nasal, but mostly oral region. Very subtle change. This is not about classification, let me stress that. I mean, we know which category people are in, nor is it geared towards any kind of attempt to diagnose. The overlap is too great for that. It's about trying to understand whether there's a systematic difference on average, and there's just a bit of an indication that there may be. And that's quite an interesting result because the neuroscientists believe that the part of the face that's most strongly implicated with the brain is this bit. So, not definitive, but informative. A little piece of the jigsaw, hopefully, that might help. Right, so medical biological study. Different application now, which is facial surgery. And this is about orthognathic surgery. Another good thing about being a statistician is you learn so much about what other people do. And there is sometimes the need to reposition the jaw, the mandible or the maxilla, because if your teeth don't meet, there can be a problem in biting and chewing. And also if you're a teenager, having a rather unusual facial shape is sometimes a bit of an issue. So there are people who go for what's called orthognathic surgery, which is amazing. You go in, it's too close to lunchtime to give you the detail, but you go in, you break the bone, take something out, or put something in to reposition it, and then you put everything back together again. Astonishing. But this is a study then on the extent to which that surgery brings facial shape into the region of controls, normals, whatever we like. In other words, it's a quantifiable way of auditing the surgery. Because the alternative is simply to look at the face and say, well, that looks all right. And it's helpful to have something a little more definitive. So this is a CT scan, and here's a face before and a face afterwards, and you can see the huge difference in facial shape that that makes in profile. And because it's CT scan, actually you can look beneath at the bone, which I'm hoping this is going to, oh, it's not going to, oh, there it goes. You can see the bone underneath, and if you look carefully, I think you can see where in the after measurement the breaks may have been made. And the question is, can we audit the result of that? And I'm going to start in a very simple way by saying one of the things you don't want to do is introduce strong asymmetry. There may be asymmetry present in the patient, possibly not. It's about this kind of movement. But if you inadvertently introduce some asymmetry, that's not going to be a good thing. So asymmetry is a single, we can express in a simple way in single scores, because what we can do is just take the shape, take its mirror image, and then match the two together, Procruste's registration. If it's perfectly symmetric, there'll be a complete match. The degree to which it doesn't match is a measure of asymmetry. So I'm going to do that on this face. Is that face symmetric? If it's got asymmetry, where is it? Well, I'm going to animate it so it moves from its current position to a completely symmetric shape. It's quite a small movement, but the eyes are where, relative to the rest of the face, where the asymmetry seems to lie visually. And if we then paint the surface again, which is quite a useful device, we can sort of do that in ways which are static, looking at how much you move in the X direction to achieve symmetry, how much in the Y, and how much in the Z. And you can see that the middle picture shows that the movement in Y of the upper regions is where it goes. So, if we have a means of measuring asymmetry, then on a facial shape, we could measure asymmetry. We can measure it in sub-features as well, if we want just to look at the nose or the mouth or wherever. And, excuse me, the important thing is to compare that to the asymmetry of controls, because we are all asymmetric. If you look closely at me, my right side is slightly smaller than my left side, right down to my feet. And most people are like that to some degree. So the black shaded areas are density strips, of which I'm a big fan, as a very simple visual means of expressing a distribution, particularly for communicating with people who are not particularly statistically trained. It's just intuitive, I find. Maybe you disagree. And marked on there are the red, which is the position of asymmetry before the operation, and the green, which is the asymmetry afterwards. And so we can track it with reference to the controls. How are we doing for time? Can I check, Giovanni? I know there's talks to follow.
10 minutes we should close.
Okay, I'll be
included the discussion.
Yeah, I'll be very fast over this last bit. That's a single number summary of the outcome, and clearly we need something a bit more complex to describe the shape. So we're promoting this idea of what we like to call the closest control. If you have a normal range for a blood pressure, and we take my blood pressure and plot my value on the axis, really the most important thing that people look at is the endpoints of the range. Am I beyond the endpoints of the range? And this is a similar idea. We've got this highly multivariate description of shape. So in that multivariate space, there is hopefully something like a multivariate normal distribution which will capture the variation. There it is, schematically in 3. Here's a particular patient, and what we'd like to do is contrast that with the normal range, the normal behavior. So one device is to project it back towards the normal, towards the control population, and stop when you hit the 95% contour. And that is a shape, the algebra that's quite simple, that's a shape which expresses control shape with the movement as close as possible to this particular outcome shape, while still retaining the identification with the control population. So here is a female face, just as an illustration. What do I have to do? Silly question. How would that shape have to change in order to be within the range of male shape? Well, we can do that, come up with the closest male shape, which is the green part, and we see that we need more prominent jaw, more prominent brows, all the things we saw earlier, but now expressed on an individual patient rather than looking at means. And so the aim is to do that for post-surgical patients. They will certainly move much closer towards the normal control population, but there's potentially useful information in saying whether there's any residual dysmorphology, as it's called, and that can be informative for the patient, it can be informative for the surgery and the process of surgery. Okay, I'm going to skate over all of that and just show you some pictures to finish and leave some time for questions. In a way, the early part of the talk was really trying to describe how we might approach a model for this particular form of data. Once we've got that model, we can attempt to bring to bear all the huge array of tools for analysis that we know. One interesting question is longitudinal. One of the earlier studies was on cleft lip and palate, where children are born with a hole here. And as a result of that, we collected control data, and that control data has been followed up for 15 years, sparsely. But what it enables us to do is build a longitudinal model. I'll just show you the end result of that. This is a 3-month-old child. Oh, did you see that on the screen? Did it move? No? There we go. So that's showing the shape change from 3 months to 6 months to 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, big gap, 12 years, 15 years, and you see the adult shape emerge. And I find it more effective to look at the profile, and you see rapid change from a baby to a toddler, and then you begin to see the adult face emerge. That's a mean, that's a model and the mean, but I find that quite pleasant to watch. Right, one very last comment, which is I've concentrated on really quite relatively straightforward situations where we're comparing groups or we're looking at a longitudinal model. This last example is about phylogeny, where my colleague Vincent Macaulay and our research student Irena Marinas, and the aim is to try to reconstruct the phylogenetic tree, but use shape information to do that. So this is a comparison of African, British, and Chinese faces, and the aim is to look at what the evidence suggests the tree for the evolution of that particular nasal shape, what that tree should be. Much more complex model, it's a Gaussian process with spatial and temporal components, which I won't describe, but can point you towards the details. That is the end result. Why is it that the British are always the odd ones out? I can't work that one out. Anyway, it looks like the evolution there is different from the African and Chinese, and it also enables you to estimate the intermediate points, the common ancestors, and so on. However, I have said enough. We have other interesting sessions to follow, so I'll thank you very much for your attention on this one.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Very interesting talk. Well, let's start the time for questions. Are there any questions from the floor?
Yes.
Yes. Please. It's the same. Just start here. Do we have a microphone? No, I don't. Okay, please.
Yeah, in one of the examples you showed at the end, can you hear me?
Yes.
In one of the examples you showed at the end where you can give up the data of how the face changes.
Yes.
From child to adult.
Yes.
Just wondering how it's possible to, given a child's face, can you learn a model that can predict how the child's going to look like?
Yes. In principle, it would, because it's a random effect model which has a mean. I beg your pardon, thank you. The question is it possible to use the longitudinal model to predict from the baby shape what the adult shape might be? Good question. In principle, yes. We haven't tried it, but in principle, yes, because it's a random effect model which allows a mean movement which is common to everyone, but the random effect is unique to that individual. So if we estimate the random effect from the baby, there would be some possibility of tracking through. How accurate it would be, I don't know. Please.
So this concerns the very last thing.
Yes.
So people reconstruct phylogenetic trees from genetic information.
Yes.
Why would you do it from faces then? I mean, how does that compare?
Well, it actually, when people originally did phylogenetic trees, it was shape that was used, interestingly enough, and then the genetics took over, and it's discrete information. So part of the aim here was to enable the phylogenetic reconstruction to happen from continuous, multivariate data. But the next obvious stage would be to use both the genetics and the shape information and combine them.
Okay, there was one more question there. Yes, please.
Maybe you could, I didn't really get the dimensionality of your models.
Yeah.
How many parameters do you have? Are they always the same number or?
Yes. Each face has the same description with the same dimensionality. I've illustrated it just by showing a discrete version of it, which in the curve form is about 450 points, which means the dimensionality is 1,000. And if you want to, you can increase that if you wish to higher values.
Have a representation through 1,000 measurements?
Yes, values, yeah.
And you can change them over time to maybe generate new faces?
Yes, within that representation you can generate what you want, either modeling or predicting or whatever. But you can change the level of representation too if you wish.
Sylvia.
I wanted to come back, very, very nice summary. I wanted to come back to your value of information, where is the information?
Yes.
So, of course, in your case, you've got a lot of prior information.
Yes.
But is it, can I interpret what you said in the positive sense? So imagine you've got, some complicated object, you don't know where the information is.
Yeah.
Would you, by actually just using this description, the curvature description,
Yeah.
would you actually find the dimension reduction that you need? Is that, you would lose something, of course, if you knew it.
Yeah.
But you don't lose that much. Have you explored that further?
No, not really. We did some examples with the mussel shells, which are just the simplest object you could imagine. And there, the curve description proved more informative than something which attempted to cover the whole thing, because the curve around the edge and over the top really summarizes the whole thing. So I think it's partly an intuitive feeling that when you have shape, it's where the curvature is that's really where the action is going to be. But there may be cases, of course, where some of that curvature is so consistent across everybody that it doesn't matter. That, I suppose, has to be the basis of further analysis to find that.
Please.
Could you give us some technical reference points on where I can find information
Yes?
doing statistics under a transformation?
Under a transformation, yes.
Basically what you use.
Yes, yes. Dryden and Mardy is the key starting point, and they have, excuse me, a very good technical description of the transformation groups and everything else. Yes, and we can talk about the details of that. I can give you other ones beyond that.
Okay. Any other question? Okay. My final question is a very general question, not related to specifically to this talk, but to the conference probably and to your experience. Maybe just a few words. You can speak for hours, but just a few words on that. So, data analysis. Where data analysis is going, and where data analysis should go, in your opinion?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm at the end of my career, so I think that's a question for the rest of the audience in a way. But the advent, the key thing that statistics always brings to data analysis is our understanding of uncertainty and variation and how we use that in models. And that's the thing that other communities don't have to such a great degree. And so in a world of data science, data analytics, and all the rest of it, that's really good for us because people are appreciating the benefit, the absolutely crucial need of quantitative analysis. But the thing we can keep bringing is this understanding of uncertainty and variation. And top of all the modeling and everything we do, that's going to make us indispensable, I think. And we should be ready to exploit that in whatever way we think most appropriate. It does, however, involve serious engagement with those other communities, and that's a lengthy and time-consuming process. But that's what I think we can bring.
Okay, so thank you, Aidan. So let's thank our speakers again. Thank you again for coming for your presentation. We are a bit late with the time scheduling. I'm sorry for that. So please leave the room if you have the session in a different room, and let's continue with the session here. Sorry, the British time for lunch is now, but we are a bit Italian today, and the lunch time is later.